All right, so we are officially live here on the live stream. We're actually together today.
Yeah,
I think it's only the second time we've done this in our office. So different component, different elements here, but yeah, excited to have everybody here. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you're listening in from. My name is Matt Solomon. I'm here with my colleague Kevin Lancaster.
yeah. I thought you had like an intro. Didn't you write some intro about yourself? And I thought we were gonna go through all this amazing stuff about you and all these crazy amazing things I've done. No, we're just gonna wing it today.
That's gonna be a pre-recorded session. We still got to do our studio session doing
week 8 or 9, and we haven't gotten the fancy stuff done yet. Now, Matt mentioned I'm Kevin Lancaster and serial entrepreneur, and spent a lot of time developing technologies, advising tech CEOs, building out companies. Most recently with ID Agent, sold that to Kaseya, and now on to the next evolution, next thing, in the tech space. So we're trying to keep this a consistent weekly show. Our guest this week is pretty damn consistent with his show. So maybe we can learn a thing or two from him, during this chat. But yeah, what's the latest in your world? Anything?
Yeah, well, now that you just touted yourself, I feel like I have to now say who I am, I guess.
Who are you?
Yeah, well, so I'd say best known as a product evangelist for your company previously at ID Agent.
Companies,
yeah. being on the road, telling the story, getting in front of MSPs really across the world. And, really dove in pretty early on, at least I feel like early on the LinkedIn ride on social media. And yeah, so one of the things, I guess, this week that I actually was featured in was a panel. And I know our guest was a host on one of the panels. So I had a panel on the Cisco Elevate virtual event, had about 50 thought leaders. And myself, Andrew Heaton, Glenn Robertson, Heather Margolis, and Michelle McBain, who was the moderator, did a session on marketing and ways for MSPs to increase their ROI, and I mean, some of it crosses over to the vendor side as well. So we had some interesting conversations around, and I think I would say one of the big themes was understanding your story. Yeah. What's different, what's going to ultimately differentiate you as an MSP, especially in such a commoditized industry as some of the services. So I think that's something we obviously honed in on at ID Agent.
It's a great session topic, specifically because I think a lot of people have a hard time figuring out their story, what their superpower is, what makes them different, especially when you're in crowded marketplaces, being a vendor or an MSP, right? How do you really differentiate when you're essentially selling the same thing? What is different? What's unique? What's the superpower? So that was a great session. So I know you had Power Pack panel, and Michelle is she's a leading voice in this entire channel. So that was a pretty darn good one. So
absolutely.
Good
job. And before we bring in our special guest, I guess, what have you been up to this week?
Just keep on keeping on. We're in the process of building out this next platform. Hopefully we'll be able to share it sooner rather than later, but great. We passed a nice big milestone. We actually made our first payroll, which was a pleasure to do. We've got just a super talented team internally. Some folks that I've known for a while. Our head of engineering development, she's the tops. And so I'm really excited about the traction, the progress we've made with this platform, and our team of 9 developers. So I've been, pretty much heads down trying to get this thing up and running and working the value proposition and messaging. Next week's a big week where we sit down with the branding company that we worked with for ID Agent and Dark Web, and they're notorious or infamous for the smoke monster and everything that we did with ID Agent. And I know they won a couple of awards for the branding of that of ID Agent and Dark Web. So really excited to see what they come up with next week. So it's just a lot of my time is really just making sure this thing's taking off, or it's primed to take off. And then I'm still working with a number of different tech entrepreneurs, CEOs, organizations, and helping them with their strategies, their go-to-markets, fundraise. And so I don't know, there's back to like really getting involved and getting excited about all these things channels. So this is it's been a fun week.
Absolutely. So if you're out there listening, again, we always encourage and love get to hear feedback. So during the live stream, if you want to tell us where you're listening in from, that's always fun. But if you have any questions or thoughts, please fire away. We tend to read those during the session, and we can ask either one of us or our guest. And so, Kevin, I think I'll let you introduce our guest, since I think you have a pretty longer relationship with Andrew. So I'll let you.
Yeah. So we're proud to bring on Andrew Morgan onto this week's session. I got to know him. Yes, what about a year ago or so, maybe just over a year, when you were launching your community, and it's been amazing to follow you and seeing just how robust of a community and how important of a community it's become in the channel. So yeah, I'm honored to be able to bring you on our show and talk shop.
Well, likewise, thank you for having me, Kevin and Kevin. Both of you.
This is very confusing with me.
I was going to say, I'm like, wait, am I gonna miss? But I do want to say one thing. Congrats on making payroll. My check still hasn't come.
Oh, so. Yeah. Let me write that down. We got to fix that glitch, right? Yeah, there you go. Yep.
I want to interview you. What's going on, man? This sounds exciting.
Maybe we'll reciprocate in a couple weeks or something like that. But yeah. It's exciting. But so yeah, we got a chance to meet actually virtually. I don't know if we've actually met in person, but so how long have you had the cyber show now? I mean, it's over a year old now, right?
Yeah, in fact, we're at episode, I think, 66 coming up this week, because it's weekly. And, we take a few weeks, obviously, because of certain holidays like Labor Day, we just took off. And you were kind of gracious enough to come on early on, Kevin, to some of our panels. I really appreciate that. And, we, on our year anniversary, we had Verizon come on, one of their key authors for the Verizon data breach report. And the show with the cyber call is really, I go for a ride. I got Wes Spencer, the CISO of Pert Security, Ryan Weeks, the CISO of Datto, and on the business side, I've got Gary Pica. And then, so I'm very fortunate. Use the overused term of blessed, but I am very blessed to have such great friends and talent that really make the show, and then the community. At now 3850, wow. Between 3,850 MSP and MSSPs have participated and viewed the cyber call, and they really, I mean, if you ever pop in, the chat is just hysterical. And the MSPs community isn't opinionated whatsoever and won't tell you how they feel. Very shy group, but it's just been an incredible ride. And the thing that keeps it going is you get emails every week of how it's impacted companies' businesses. So in a very positive way.
I bet. So we're at 38 and going to 50. So there are ways to
we got over 100 subscribers to our YouTube channel. I think once we actually formalize it and make this a podcast, I think we'll have a lot more. And we have hundreds of views through LinkedIn Live.
I think we changed it to a comedy show.
Basically,
we would probably do a little bit better. That's probably the most consistent feedback we get is the banter and the jabs back and forth. And so maybe we should retitle this.
Yeah. So it's funny and I'll bring this back, but you mentioned holidays. I think that hopefully my mom isn't watching, because today's Yom Kippur, which is a very religious holiday, and I technically shouldn't be on here doing this, but hopefully she's not watching. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you about the Cyber Nation, because I really believe like MSPs, are struggling to figure out what is what makes them different. And we're seeing some start to build out their own niche and their own little communities, whether that's co-managed IT or stuff around just being like professional looks and how you present yourself. I guess how did you start? Because you didn't start at 3,800, MSPs. Like, you had to start it somewhere when it was like technically, well, I don't know if no one was watching, but in the beginning you had to start getting the word. Could you just walk our audience through that? Because I think that's the hardest part, is just getting started.
Yeah. So just to clarify, Kevin, you started mentioning MSPs differentiating themselves. Do you want me to talk about that or the growth of the cyber call? Both. You tell me where you want me to focus.
I think how you built this, built the community up, because I think that can apply to anybody, that's watching.
Yeah, sure. So, well, the communities we have, whether it's Cyber Call, Cyber Nation, or the podcast, the Cybercast, these are all free resources for MSP and MSSPs. And people sometimes say, well, how do you make a living, Andrew? I run go-to-market strategies in the background for several cyber vendors. And again, I'm very grateful to the support I've gotten from those companies. The way in which the cyber call got started, I have to say, is I think I had a kind of a head start. And what I mean by that is, so one of my clients was Perch Security, and we got PerchyCon, our idea there that I helped develop and nurture, was that we wanted to do kind of an MSP focused security. Like, could we do a black hat? Notice the air quote. I'm not saying it was a black hat, but like a black hat security event for MSPs. And, that was the notion. And, it was very successful. We sold it out and we got it off literally weeks before the COVID shutdown. So it was the last week in January of 2020. And then obviously we know what happened, and the MSPs were just running nonstop, getting all of their clients into remote work environments. And as that was going on, every show was canceled, peer groups were canceled. I went to Aaron and Wes and I said, look, I think, by the time this settles down here, maybe in April of 2020, I said, I think the MSPs are going to need something. So I created something called the CyberCon. And I went to my good friend, also Andrew Kaiser at Huntress, because they have a small following. They've done okay building a community. I said, hey, Andrew, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? And he's like, I think it's a great idea. We'd love to kind of partner. So I did a 5-day event in April of 2020, and we had like 1,700 MSPs. And, we had everything from, a capture the flag, 4-day capture the flag event, you name the who's who. And it was a really well done. And basically I said, do you guys want to keep this going somehow, some way? And I took a week or two to think about, well, how could we do something meaningful, right, for MSPs? And I got this idea that, if you're in the financial services world, like you're a hedge fund, right, you follow all of these different industries, and you can never really just say, hey, Kevin, Matt, you guys are interested in, our hedge fund, come on today, and we're going to talk about, every single vertical industry and who we cover, long, shorts, et cetera, right? It would be crazy. Well, I think security is similar, right? In other words, we have so many different disciplines, frameworks. We could go on and on: compliance, red teams, blue teams, purple teams, on and on and on. And so that was the genesis that I said, if I could get some really talented people, that co-hosts, and we could talk about different security topics and domains that MSPs need help with, I wanted to give it a shot. And that was really the genesis. And I mentioned it, and people were very open to it. So that was kind of like, I think I had a little bit of a head start. So that's really the genesis of it. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, I think, if I was an MSP listening, I could, one takeaway would be like, it's an opportunity to team up with some small business owners in your community, and you leverage their audiences right away as well. So, I'm just a big proponent of, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, make things make it your own, but see what other people are doing successfully, and it doesn't even have to be in your industry, and create a version of that for yourself. So I think, yeah, it's totally something an MSP could do.
Yeah, no, what I appreciate about it is that you filled a void, for one, right? And you're taking complex topics and yeah, you follow the threads, and the banter back and forth in the chat box, right? You've taken some of these really important but really complex topics, and you've turned them into something that's enjoyable to watch, right? I mean, when you get Pika on there and Wes, and they both have pretty big personalities, right? You get some really good exchanges, but you take, again, complex topics and make it fun, for the audience. And so, what how do you decide what topics that you're going to talk about? Because I know at times there's topical things, and I receive your alerts anytime there's a big breach or a big patch that needs to be deployed out in the community. But how do you go about figuring out what topics to talk about on a weekly basis?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, because it's not always prescriptive, Kevin. That's full transparency. It's like you said, it's certainly easier, if there's an incident. And then I'll give you an example. Obviously, we had the July 4th incident, and that spawned off a bunch of different things. So we dealt with that specific incident, but then we started to talk about supply chain risk. So we brought on, an expert, and that's the other thing. I mean, the guests have been incredibly gracious. Like when we finally got to, Ryan on the show said, how do we help MSPs, spot, good application security in the vendors they're choosing? He's like, my favorite instructor of all times is John Strand from Black Hills. And, he was a 15-year SANS instructor, et cetera. He goes, man, if we could get John Strand on here to talk about, one of the top offensive minds in the world on spotting good application security, that would be awesome. He said yes like that. And, what I've come to learn about, and I promise I'll get back on topic for you guys about how you decide. But what I've learned is the one thing that's amazing about the security industry, the best minds are often the most humble people. Like John Strand doesn't have to come on the cyber call. John Strand didn't have to get involved in, with his training and help. We've involved him now with a bunch of MSPs on a training initiative, but he's been selfless with his time, coming on the cyber call multiple times. And but anyway, back to your point, typically something drives a whole host of topics out of it. That led into, it came back on topic, but, as far as I know, we did the first threat modeling event for MSPs. Like, I don't think MSPs holistically really understood MITRE ATT&CK, how to build threat profiles, how to, look at a threat actor, what tools they could use to check their defenses. And so, the whole point of this is, our mission is to, continually elevate the MSPs. And I'm going off topic, but I just want to say this. It's really, bothers me because there's a lot of people that take shots at MSPs, and it is not an easy business. First off, aside from all the fact that they're under attack, building Matt Solomon, Matt, I messed up the names early. Matt, you said it early on That's what got me confused because Kevin was over you.
I fixed the name here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
But it should be Kevin Lancaster and Matt Solomon,
Okay.
not Matt Solomon and Kevin Lancaster.
Yeah.
Well, I'm dyslexic. It looks perfect to me.
Oh, perfect. All right, it works out. Yeah.
I forgot where I was going.
Sorry. We're talking about MSPs being under.
So like you've said it early on, Matt, how they differentiate, right? So what my whole thing is, like this is a tough business, right? And now on top of it, you really, an MSP, hate to say it, but if you're going to be relevant in this business, you have to treat yourself. We call it client zero. You have to build a security program, and you have to get pretty, what's going to differentiate yourself, Matt? And this is answering part of that question. You have to be client zero, and you have to implement a security program, and you have to get pretty good at understanding security controls, policies within, and build a culture internally. I truly believe if you're going to survive this over the next few years, because we're already seeing this, and we talk about this on the cyber call. So if you've tuned in, I'm sorry for being ad nauseum. But it is absolutely true. The MSPs that are pulling away, selling the most, selling at the highest price, they're the ones that have been implementing security programs over the past 3, 4, 5 years. They are so far advanced relative to the norm. Their conversations they have with their customers, because they, this is Gary Pica term, right? Command. He talks about a command in the business, but you can't have a legitimate sales conversation these days around, the threat landscape. If you're not doing this internally, you can't go, let's talk about some facet of cybersecurity, because it's not going to be authentic. Unless you're building that internally. So I come back to why are we doing this? Our mission is because there's a lot of work to be done.
Along those lines, that's one of the things I would speak about often is this concept of maturity model in the MSP space, and not speaking from a framework, model or whatever, but like the actual MSPs themselves. You mentioned there's a widening gap between the ones that know it and do it really well, and the ones that are learning it or refusing to learn it, I guess, right? So you're creating this massive divide, and you're polarizing this maturity model. Where does this go over the next 4 or 5 years for the MSP space? Does it become dominated by a handful of massive PE-backed security first MSPs, or does the rest of the marketplace have the opportunity to catch up over the next couple of years?
Well, I think both. And not to just give you a patented answer, let me explain. Look, the PE-backed MSPs have a huge advantage, and at certain, especially the ones that are allowing the culture to exist still within the acquisitions or partial. I know some MSPs that are doing the way they're doing their roll-ups are really unique, which is letting the owner take some stuff off the table, but keeping their culture, centralizing tools. But I mean, look, it's no secret. And, Kevin, you talked about being a serial entrepreneur, and look, those companies, I think if they're run well, which typically PE-backed firms are run well, if they have good management at the, top of that MSP, they're going to pull away, I think, in a massive way, because they can streamline so many things. I mean, think about it. What MSP on the margin can just go, yeah, we have an internal CISO. We have internal security people. Now you're PE backed. That cost isn't as daunting. Yeah. That I could spread over multitudes of companies, and therefore, so I do feel that is going to be a significant advantage for those companies, and they get to cherry pick, right, Kevin and Matt? If you're let's just be honest. If you're an MSP that's been around 20 years and you're doing well, let's just say you're a True Methods member, you got really good margins, you've been implementing a security program and someone comes along and offers you some really good multiple, why not, right? And especially if you can keep some interest, et cetera, et cetera. Can the others catch up is the second part of the question. Yeah, they can. It's a lot of work. And so you got to start doing something. I think, if there's anything I would encourage MSPs to start doing is do something. Jason Slagle, do you guys know of Jason? Mm-hmm. One of my favorites out there because he walks his walk, right? I mean, this is a guy that, is opinionated and he's the first one to say it, right? And he will not hold back when he sees something. But that guy works hard. He actively implements, CIS into his organization. He actively beats himself up, in terms of where he needs to get better. And that's the hallmark, I would say, of these, and he's not a massive MSP, but he's committed. So it's possible. I mean, I've seen MSPs completely transform their businesses. And Matt and Kevin, I just, last thing I'll say and turn back to some questions to you. I don't think it's different from any other industry, right? Everybody has the opportunity. And I think in any industry, you're going to have that top 7 to 10% that just makes significantly more money, has significantly more mature businesses. It's culture, it's commitment, so that, I don't know if that helps answer the question, but that's what I see.
No, it's spot on. Absolutely.
And I want to just give a quick shout out to Gabe from New Orleans who's listening in. So thank you, Gabe, for tuning in. And one thing I was going to go back to, just a quick mention to people listening. You mentioned the Verizon data breach report. When I'm talking to MSPs, one of the things they talk about is they struggle for content. Well, the Verizon data breach report is just chock full of content. I mean, each page probably has statistics that you could turn into content, whether that's a little video or maybe a blog around the topic or percentage, or what are the top attacks that are happening. So I would just say, if you're struggling for content, that thing could feed you for months. Because it is quite an extensive report that they put out there.
Well, Matt, you speak about content, like, the cyber call, everything's there. Like you can chronologically go back and listen to. I hope MSPs take some of that. I've worked with some MSPs that on their lunch and learns, on their roadshow marketing and what they're doing. I mean, there's one MSP in the Midwest that is just doing amazing. Now they're bigger, so they have resources, but they're really focused on what we call right of boom, which is basically post exploitation. You have, if you think about Sunil Yu and the cyber defense matrix, if you look that up, just Google cyber defense matrix. What he does is he built a 5x5 grid with NIST CSF up top, right? Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And then down, so the things we do in security versus the things we care about, like devices, data, et cetera, et cetera. So you see this 5x5 grid and you can quickly determine, where and then people, process, technology underneath. My point of just sharing that is, MSPs, if you start focusing on things like what happens post-event with your customers, I think it takes a lot of the FUD out of the conversation. In other words, historically, it's been, if we do this preventative control, we can stop this attack. If we do this preventative, and then let's layer in this and this and this and this. Well, look, you don't have to hear it from me, right? Look at the top attacks, the biggest of big companies, right, that have been exploited. And typically, by the way, it's nothing unique in terms of how they're being exploited, right? It's password hygiene, it's a vulnerability unpatched, it's some type of port that was open. It's not these earth-shattering things, But my point of bringing that up is start having, what we call assume breach conversations with your customers, right? Start having, hey, or if it's a prospect, talk to me about how your current provider is working with you on your incident response plan. What do you mean an incident response plan?
Yeah.
Well, have they ever taken that incident response plan and kind of simulated an event? Have they ever made sure you have the right roles and responsibilities in place? Not if, but when you guys have some type of an event. Do you know what order things you would do? Call cyber insurance, call legal, etc. How's that going? Right? If you start having those conversations with your prospects, I can probably pretty much promise you your current provider in there isn't.
Yeah, no, you're spot on again, because it's, to your point, for forever, especially the last probably 5 years, it's been layer this on, layer that on, layer this on, layer that on. And the MSP is struggling to figure out, well, I can't increase my cost, and how's that going to affect my profitability? And I just raised my prices, and now I got to go back to my customer and tell them they got to buy this. And then they go to a trade show and there's 19 new shiny objects out there that I got to add that in. And so it's just perpetual cycle of added expense, and until you pivot the message, right? To your point, until you pivot the message, and you start, and we're now at a point where we can start with assume breach because of the prevalence, and it's in the general population, the lexicon. Now everyone understands that that's the zeitgeist, I guess the best way to say it. Everyone understands that, now it's not a matter of if, it's when, and what can you do to mitigate my risk. And you start at the conversation on the other end of the spectrum, it becomes a much easier conversation. It's a business conversation, it's a strategic conversation versus, now you're adding in this and adding in that. So well put. And, so when you're not, working on all these great, outlets, informational outlets and podcasts and platforms and stuff, you mentioned you're working with some organizations on their go-to-market. So what else are you up to these days outside of being one hell of a content producer?
Well, thank you for the comment. Yeah. Just being at a personal level, just trying to be a really good dad to my 2 kids, trying to stay healthy, trying to learn, from folks like yourself, Matt and Kevin, and, place people at your organization. Kidding. But no, I just love being a connector, quite honestly. I love helping people. That's what I get, I think, the most joy out of, and making a difference. So.
Well, you are one hell of a connector. I've experienced that personally several times. I think one of the more interesting ones was, I had a good friend of mine who is a partner in the law firm in the South Florida area. We'll just kind of generalize it. And they're a sizable law firm with all the complexities of a sizable law firm, but they didn't have anybody running security. And they're sizable. I'm talking hundreds of employees, and they have really big customers that you talked about supply chain earlier, that were coming to them and saying, you need to fill out this assessment, this questionnaire. We have to understand, what risk you pose to us as a supplier, as a vendor to this large organization. And fortunately, I've been able to beat them up because they didn't have any of these things in place. They didn't have security. They had a very basic, the most basic of basic MSPs, just keeping their email, exchange up and running. And so I can't thank you enough for that referral, because that worked out really well for them. And I think they're in a much better spot now relative to where they were. And so just kudos to you on your ability to connect, and always giving back. And that's something I don't know if it's brought up all that often, but you can kind of see that you're connecting, you're always giving, you're always sharing, you're become a conduit, an important voice in this space, right? Because you're doing it from I think a place of good and getting information out there and helping folks. So that's just want to give you the little props there.
Right. Thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I know we want to be mindful of your time, Andrew, and I know you have a busy day ahead of you. Just real quick, Gabe, we'll put a reference in, to the Verizon data breach so everybody can access that. Kayvon from Miami is here. Just wanted to give a shout out there. And one, I would also echo Kevin's sentiment. Last night, me and you spoke for like 2 minutes, and you were just like, well, how can I help? And I think this actually goes back to a point you talked about. While I am a fan of like having plans for some of the streams we're doing, and I'm definitely more comfortable that way. I probably gave you the word, like you were just like, well, what do you want to talk about? And I think to sum it up, I was just like, can you just come on? Like was basically like, we'll figure it out. Kind of, I was like, and I knew you and Kevin had a relationship, so I was like, I just wasn't too worried that we were going to have an issue, and I think it came out great. So I think to that point, sometimes just being spontaneous and getting people in your network to have conversations is important. And one last thing I was going to bring up when you were talking about, the MSPs talking about their services, again, I kind of started off the conversation at the beginning talking about stories, and at ID Agent, 40% of my presentation was stories from MSPs utilizing our service. And I actually heard an MSP tell us, shared a story on LinkedIn, and there was those northeastern storms, hurricanes, tornadoes that were pretty recent. And he literally was just talking about, he signed a client a week before the storms, and at that time they did not have functional backups. And thank God they signed with him, because then they had the backups in place. But like, that is the story that person can now tell every time in every meeting, as far as I'm concerned, versus going into all the details of backup. Just tell the stories and then ask questions like what would that mean to your organization if you were down for this? And then if you have your calculators and things like that, you can really show what it would cost. So a big proponent of that. But Andrew, I'll let you close things out. Yeah, on your final thoughts.
Well, Kevin, you mentioned something with the story in Miami and supply chain. And what I do want to talk about, I guess, in closing is, in some respects, MSPs have been given a carrot and stick. And we talked about building your own internal security program. You mentioned this law firm got a third party, their customers sending in, we need to know about your security program. If MSPs haven't gotten them yet, I think if you don't think you're not going to get a lot more third-party audit questionnaires about your own internal security over the next 12 months, I really hate to tell you, you're way behind the curve. Because, we talked about this yesterday, Jason Slagle and I, on the Cisco event. Often, we talked M&A, right? So what happens? MSPs have some big customers, right? More than likely, that big customer is going to be a target also of acquisition. And what if that acquisition is by a public company or a highly regulated industry? The first thing, as quick as your head can spin, is as soon as they understand what's going on and who their providers are, you're going to get a questionnaire and you're going to be in touch by their security audit team. If you got your stuff together, you're going to be good. If you don't, I think the time's ticking before they go, not really comfortable about your current MSP. So if you don't think about what's happening in the industry from that perspective, the roll up of M&A out just in general, the fact that states are passing legislation which is supporting CIS, Center for Internet Security Controls, and providing safe harbor if that customer implements them. Well, again, as an MSP, if that's your customer, or if you're working with a state agency, again, this is all going to roll back eventually to you, talking about your security program and proving out your internal security controls. Now, that's the the stick. The carrot is that I think we've been given, which is kind of a twin carrot stick, is cyber insurance. But cyber insurance renewals used to be 5 questions, and do you have a heartbeat? And we'll insure somebody up to 250 million. Well, since the July 4th incident, we've seen a number of carriers drop out, insuring MSPs, more leaving, and caps at $2 million. Well, what is also saying, if you look at security renewal questionnaires, they've increased from, over the past few years, from 5 questions, the last year a few pages, now 6, 7, 8 pages. That also mirror, typically, they don't call it out, but they're mirroring CIS controls IG1, implementation group 1. Just bring one of those into a client or prospect. And as Gary Pica says, like, your costs have changed. I didn't increase your costs. The threat landscape has. I don't have to tell you about implementing EDR and MFA. You're not going to get your cyber renewal if you don't do it, or they're not going to cover you to the level you had previously without these specific preventative controls or detective controls in place. So, that's probably how I'd end things out, is that, there's a lot of macro, never before have we had such macro events that are impacting, us in both positive and negative ways. But again, we have to, ride that wave right now, if that makes sense.
100%. You're so spot on. It's everybody now has to start taking this serious, and you can't just go down the list and say yes or no in these questionnaires. You really understand what you're signing and the implications. And I think everybody needs to take some time and understand it. And certainly everybody should be tuning in to the cyber call on a weekly basis to make sure that they're getting the latest and greatest from you. And your merry bunch of contributors there. So
yeah, the guys that actually make it happen. But thanks a million for having me on, Matt and Kevin. I really appreciate it.
No, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. And actually, for the first time ever, I know who our guest is next week. So it's Paul Green out of the UK. He's a marketing guru, works with tons of MSPs. He's got incredible insights into kind of the best ways to draw out ROI. But he's really, what we're going to be talking about next week is how to build your prospecting list. So how do you start building that out so that you can actually have people to market to, which is pretty important.
That helps.
So, all right, Andrew, thanks again so much for your time. And thank you to everybody listening in the social networks.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Have a great day.